Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Soul of Business with Blaine Bartlett. I am your host, Blaine Bartlett. Part of the idea that I had when I started this podcast was how do we find ways to keep both ourselves, but also the people that we interact with, whether they're staff or whether they are vendors or whether they are actually customers of ours. How do we keep them connected to that spirit that was present when the organization was founded, that kind of esprit. And the organization actually is, any organization, at least in its initial incarnation, is an expression of that founding spirit. And as I've, over the decades that I've worked with organizations, large and small around the world, the thing that keeps cropping up for me, amongst a couple of other things here, is the environment. We call it culture, but the idea of an environment that designs me in return. There's a reciprocity, and we can, there's a formal name for that, and it's called ontological design. How do I design a reality that actually has an impact on who I am and who we are? So my guest today, Christy Pretzinger, is the CEO and founder of an organization called WG Content, and a large part, I say a large part, almost an exclusive part of what they do is looking at how they transform businesses based on utilizing the organization's culture as a focal point. And there's all kinds of permutations that begin to develop out of that. So without a whole lot of other fluff and filler on that, I just want to welcome Christy to the show. And I think we're going to have a great conversation because this is a topic that I absolutely love. And when her publicist sent me the information about her, I just jumped. I like to fish, and I've seen fish, kind of, when my fly drives by them, if it's really attractive, they'll just jump at it. I was the fish, and the fly that was tangled in front of me, caused me to jump. So, Christy, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Blaine. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I am too. How did this, the whole idea of culture, environmental, and just the environment in which we find ourselves living and working and breathing and interacting. How did that become a focal point for you?
Well, years ago, when I began building the business, I said to my accountant at the time that if I couldn't build a business based on kindness, I would go back to being a freelance writer, which is what I had been doing.
Mm-hmm.
Then, of course, as anyone who's a founder knows, you wear all the hats, you put your head down and you're selling, and then you're operating. And then you're like, oh, no pipeline. I got to, so you're doing all the things. It was really only in hindsight, probably about 5 years ago, when we were working with some consultants and they did a survey of all of the employees. And they were seeking the core of our business, the thing without which we would not exist. And they discovered that culture is the core of our business, which was interesting to me. And it kind of thrust me back to all those years ago when I first started doing this. And I realized that while I didn't have constant attention on my intention of building a business based on kindness, I definitely had attention towards it. I believe you have to have an intention and attention.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point, it's really the heart and soul of that founder when you start. And that was always a very important, kindness still is a very important key element of who I am as a human being. And I look at this business as an extension of that. And the way that I have built this business, the way that I operate this business, really contributes to, it gives my life meaning and purpose. So I'm not just looking at the bottom line. I'm really all about creating an environment where people can thrive. And it has grown obviously from there.
Now, founding a couple of things come to mind here. One, I love the way that you phrase this, that core without which we couldn't exist. And I'll oftentimes ask my guests to define for them, but also for the listening audience, what they think the soul of business is when they hear the term the soul of business. And I'm not going to ask you to do that because you already did that when you said it's that core without which we couldn't exist. Yeah, its absence. The core of kindness runs smack dab into the face oftentimes, and this is the common myth, I think, run smack dab into the face of business realities.
Yeah,
How do
sure.
How do we maintain kindness when all of a sudden our margins are getting squeezed, or a supplier is all of a sudden, the supply chain, issues after COVID. I mean, we're just upside down. And how did you maintain? This is actually the question. How did you maintain a focus on, but more than a focus on, an operational connection to kindness as you dealt with some of these issues?
I always say don't mistake kindness for weakness. They're two very different things. And I think that it's a real a tendency to think that business is all cut and dried and all these kind of things that, and I mean this in an energy sense, not in a gender sense, things that tend to be viewed as more masculine.
Yep.
And I actually think that's aberrant thinking, that the thing about kindness is that clarity is kindness, right? I mean, that's a huge thing that you have to have in business. Boundaries are kind. Structure can be established to be kind. I always say that I didn't work for unkind people, but the structures within which they worked did not foster kindness.
Mm-hmm.
And I deliberately have worked with my team who've done so much of this work. We have built an organization with processes and structures that are designed to foster kindness, to foster relationships. Our mission is building relationships one word at a time. And we take that very seriously. I mean, we're a content company. Obviously, we use words a lot. But we also have 4 values that everybody is really aware of, and they're empowered, curious, kind, and fun. And they roll off your tongue. They're easy to remember. They're not a paragraph. They're not words on a wall somewhere. These are things that we actually live and breathe every day. And I think that one of the things about being able to hold on to that environment, to that kindness as the core of the business, as the business was growing, and as I faced various challenges, is that those values should remain constant as you build an organization or whatever's happening in your business. The expression of them may change, but the values should not change. And
Mm-hmm.
if the values remain constant, that I say they're a thread that flows through your organization and upon which every decision can hang. So whatever you're deciding to do, we want our employees to be empowered. I don't empower them. They demonstrate empowerment. They know that they are empowered to make an effective decision based on being empowered, curious, kind, and fun. I've talked to clients who are being difficult with my team. And the last thing I'm going to do is allow some young marketing person from some hospital across the country mess up my life's work here. So when I have somebody who's being unkind, I don't know this young woman. I called her boss. I didn't know her either because I have a team of people that work with them. And I just had a conversation, very frank conversation, and explained our values are, said what they were, and said, none of those things are happening, not for your team or for my team. So I don't think we can delight you. I don't think we're a fit. And interestingly enough, she was like, whoa, 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 no, we need to fix this. And she tried to ask me all these specifics, and I'm never going to throw someone under the bus because I do not know the sandbox in which they play.
Right.
So I don't know that situation. I just said, I think there's just some differences here. And the project manager that was having the issue told me later, she said, well, they still have those same issues. They just don't take them out on me anymore. And I was like, well, that's fine. I mean, we
Yeah.
can't fix that. That's their culture. That's their environment. We just want to bring our joy to the situation to the best of our ability and meet them where they are and help them, fix whatever problem they have to the best of our ability.
See, now that whole scenario is an operational conversation about how values are intended to be in action. They're not just espoused.
Yeah,
Then, to your point, they're not just artwork up on the wall.
right.
And I mean, I got chills as you were talking to me about, the idea of empowerment in large part has to do with flying air cover. I mean, to use a military term
Yeah.
here, I mean, I'm taking care of my people. I got your back.
Yes.
And if there's something egregious going on, we come back to our values and then we work from there.
Right.
And you're working in a fascinating sector, healthcare,
Yeah.
which, boy,
Yeah.
you talk about dysfunctionality. And I'm on the teaching faculty of the American Association for Physician Leadership. So I work a lot with docs, with hospital administrators, the CEO and his or her teams. And
We
it's
could go on for days
we
about
can
that.
go on for days.
Yeah.
And kindness and fun generally do not come into the lexicon. They generally don't crop up as part of the conversation. And I was, one of my older clients. was IDEO, the design firm. And
Mhm.
I remember a conversation I was having with them at one point in time about work that they were doing in the healthcare space, and the idea of bringing joy into the hospital experience. And it was almost an oxymoron. It's kind of like, how do you bring joy into the hospital experience from the patient side, from the nurse's side, from the I mean, you pick the constituency, and joy did not seem to have a place to live. Yet it's possible to do.
Well, joy and profit are sometimes at loggerheads.
Yes.
And chaos breeds opportunity. I wouldn't have a business if there weren't the chaotic healthcare system that we have. That said, I think it's travesty. There's a guy who's a thought leader. I'm not going to say his name because I don't want to give him any props in this area. I'm sure you would know his name. Considered a thought leader, and he had a newsletter out, and I read it, and I mean, I thought my head was going to blow off because it was all about, one of the questions was like talking to people about what's going to happen in the coming year. And he was normalizing a lot of things that are not normal. And then also never once mentioned the word patient, never once asked how our stakeholders, meaning the C-suite,
Yeah.
feel about trust, because they don't care about the people in the organization, whether they trust them or not. Because I mean, I'm going, they hate you. Your employees hate you, and the people that you serve hate you. So you actually throwing this thing about trust around is absurd. And then talking about how do we reach our business goals. I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
I mean, I really honestly, I'm different than a lot of business owners in that I think that looking at only the financial bottom line is aberrant to our humanity.
It
It's
is.
and it's counterintuitive to how we're wired. We are hardwired for community, for empathy, for all of these feelings. And yet we build businesses and structures that are vastly successful, incredibly wealthy, and do none of those things. So there you have it. I don't know what to say. My goal is to reinvent the way people look at the world of work, because you can make money. I mean, how much money do I need? I don't need
Yeah.
billions and billions of dollars at the
Yeah,
expense of people that work with me. That's
exactly. Well, the whole thesis of compassionate capitalism,
yeah.
over my right shoulder here, was organized around that whole time. Adam Smith, when he wrote The Wealth of Nations, prior
Mhm.
to writing The Wealth of Nations, he wrote another book, and became the foundational structure for his invisible hands
Yeah.
concept, where
Yeah.
there's a reciprocity in this. And yeah, if we're not mutually winning, then something's off. And mutually winning doesn't mean your business thrives and my business thrives. It means the ecosystem, everything that is touched by
We need
business,
employees,
thrives.
and we need a middle class. So we're just living in the world of the 80s trickle down that has proven time and time and time and time again that it doesn't work. And yet, we don't seem to learn here, and we don't seem to put humanity at the core of what we do. And that is really my mission in my life. What gives my life meaning and purpose is saying, look, we have more in common than we don't. I mean, I look at the horrors that are happening out in Los Angeles right now. And I
Oh,
always used to say, for example, that if your neighbor's house is burning down, you don't say, who did you vote for? You say, how can I help you? How can I
exactly.
help you? Because that's who we are. That is literally who we are. And people just make a lot of money from dividing us. But I know that we have more in common, that our feelings, our humanity, our connection to one another is through those feelings of empathy and anguish and sadness and joy. That's the humanity of things, not how much money you have and what kind of clothes you wear.
Hi, I'd like to ask you to do something for me if you wouldn't mind. If you like this episode, I'd like you to not only subscribe on your favorite site, but I'd also like you to give a rating. Ideally, a 5-star rating would be greatly appreciated. But I think more importantly also would be just some comments. That helps with the algorithm and it helps build the audience with this. And more than anything else, if you could invite somebody else to listen, just share this episode with a friend, with a colleague. And I'd like to see how we can grow the soul of business. I think it makes a difference. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, the way we define success in this culture, particularly in the Western cultures,
Yeah.
Western business cultures, has gone off the rails in a very significant way. And
Yes.
I want you, so bringing this kind of full circle back to the values conversation here. You've built, and I love I love things that are simple, clarity, um, structure, and what was the third one? It was
Boundaries.
boundaries. I can't read my own writing here. Yeah, clear boundaries. So when you're building a workplace culture, those, I mean, if I look at these things as from an ontological perspective or from a design perspective, these become the design frameworks.
Mm-hmm.
In the work that you do with your client, how do you actually begin to facilitate the development of a culture, particularly one that has seemed to kind of gone off the rails a little bit?
Well, as I said earlier, we don't know the sandbox in which our clients play.
Mm-hmm.
And we probably have a general idea that there's like some dysfunction going on, but we don't know specifics, generally speaking. But we really do say we jump into that sandbox with them and help them dig their way out. So there's a great amount of empathy there for, I'm not going to judge what you're facing because I don't know that. We are not somebody who comes in and is like, let me tell you everything you're doing wrong, because we're like, we don't know the parameters that they're working with. So when it comes to and again, as we get larger, it's hard. We try to keep focusing on these things with all of the people in the organization. One of the things we do when we first kick off a project with a client is we sit down with the stakeholder, the client stakeholder, whoever it is, because usually it's not the purchaser. It's usually someone at a lower level that we're going to be working on a daily basis with. And we work very hard to say, this is how we work. And we like to ask your permission to hold you accountable to things you agree to, because our job is to keep this moving for you to the best of our ability.
Yeah.
And I always joke that we walk that fine line between harassment and staying in touch, because these people are so busy that's why we're there. But sometimes they're like, I just can't get back to you. And we understand that. And we try and we're not, bugging them. But at the same time, we're like, we're here. We just want to remind you, we've got this going on. So we ask for permission to hold them accountable. We are clear about the processes that we have, what the terms of the agreement are, like how many revisions or how are things going to go, managing expectations from the outset. I think that is one of the kindest things you can do. So people aren't like, wait, what? I only get 2 sets of revisions. I thought I got 4. Like, no, it's right there in the contract. You get 2. So we try and be as clear about that. And the thing about boundaries, I learned this years ago. Part of it was with the woman in the situation I just talked about, where I had to call and say that we weren't a fit, is that they were on West Coast time and we are in East Coast time. And generally speaking, we say at the outset, we work East Coast hours. We close between 5 and 5:30. Now, if there's an emergency, absolutely, we will help you. But by and large, that's how we work. And what happened in this particular situation, which was very unkind, is the woman called our project manager, and it was like 7:30 at night. She was making dinner and her phone was there and her son answered it. And it was like it was on Alexa, it was playing music. So all of a sudden she's on this phone call. And so the client starts asking her all these questions and she's like flustered because she's not in that headspace. She's not in front of her desk. She's not prepared to answer. And she's saying, I'm really kind of not prepared. I'm sorry. This, I wasn't aware of this, whatever. And then the woman on the other end said, oh, by the way, you're on speaker. There's 10 of us here. I heard that and I was like, well, that's the end of that. So, that was another thing, setting up a boundary, saying we don't operate that way. We would never do that to someone. We would never set someone up like that.
Yeah.
And so making sure that our employees know that you are allowed to say, I'm sorry, that's a boundary. We don't do that. And you just say it kindly. You say it within our values, right? But you set the boundary using kindness to know that when I talk a lot about letting people know that they matter, and all of the people that work for WG Content know that I believe they matter. Their hopes, their dreams, their individual lives matter. And that means that they set boundaries for themselves. That means that the client isn't always right.
Mm-hmm.
There are places where it's like you don't work weekends and nights because somebody else can't get their act together. You have a boundary to protect yourself too, because your life matters just as much as the client's life matters.
The idea of saying no, being able to say no.
Yeah.
I mean, I cannot tell you how big a deal that is in most organizations that I end up coaching or consulting within. And I have never heard anybody link it in the way that you just did here. Being able to say no is our way of saying you matter.
Yeah. To the employee.
Yeah, to the employee, to the person saying no. It's kind of like, yeah. And within the content, the contextual framing, values framing of boundaries,
Yep.
and balance, work-life balance,
Yeah.
which I think is, we got that reversed. It should be life-work balance.
We actually call it life work balance.
Do you?
Intentional
Okay. Yeah.
life work balance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to get the most appropriate thing in the front end here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's my life and I work. But yeah.
Right. But
Yeah.
I work to live. I don't live to work.
Hmm.
Different things.
Yeah. There's um, an idea that's kind of percolating in my mind here, and it has to do with the nature of trust. You'd alluded to that earlier in the conversation. And trust gets to be kind of a confusing conversation, I think, in some organizations, because a lot of people don't know what's really in play when we're talking about trust. When I say I trust you, what am I paying attention to? And yeah, it could be competency, it could be character, it could be consistency, it could any number of different things. But unless I've got a basis to define what trust means for the individual that's having an issue with it or trying to establish it, then we're all over the map. But again, if I've got clarity, if I've got boundaries, and I've got structure, and part of what I'm going to here has to do with a conversational structure that allows for discovery. And partly, I think what occurs here, particularly from a management leadership perspective, is if I take time out and say, okay, let's talk about trust. Let's be sure we're all clear about that. It requires some vulnerability on my part to be able to stop the process, back the truck up, and say, let's open the conversation up here, rather than assuming that what you think is trust and what I think of trust are the same thing.
I've never thought about it that way. That's interesting. What I do talk about trust a lot, and I say that it's a long game, but you can
Mhm.
blow it in a minute.
Yeah.
And that when people first join the organization, they may not believe that I mean what I say and I say what I mean as the leader. And over time, they learn to see that. And frequently, a lot of our employees come in, they've either been a 1099 contractor or they are a previous coworker of an employee. So the current employee is saying, you got to come here. This place is great. But I always think that trust is a long game, and it's a part of all of those things that you're talking about. That, trust is people knowing, again, that they truly matter to me,
Mm-hmm.
that I have their back, that I say what I mean what I say, that I'm going to listen when they have something to talk about. And to your point, leading with vulnerability, which I'm telling you what, when I watched that Brene Brown TED Talk in
Oh,
2010,
yeah, that's what I
I
was
would
thinking.
have gone to my grave saying vulnerability was weakness. I mean, I was like a calf at a new gate. I was like, wait, what? What is that? I watched it like 15 times. It changed my life. So I started reading all of her books and learning about it and all that stuff. And now it comes naturally. And the thing that I've learned about vulnerability as a leader is that if you are willing to be a little bit vulnerable in whatever way, and it might be just kind of self-deprecating, it might be humor, it's not like you have to tell your life story, but a little bit vulnerable,
Yeah,
then it, number one, makes people like you. Number two, it makes them feel safe with you. And we cannot underestimate the power of psychological safety in the workplace.
absolutely.
And it makes them feel free to be a little bit vulnerable so you can have a real conversation there.
Yeah, that vulnerability piece, and vulnerability, authenticity. There's kind of some collapsing that kind of takes place in that. An old mentor of mine years ago said to me, "We connect through vulnerability." So that's the only way we ever connect is through vulnerability. And I stopped for a moment and I, backed up, and then I started doing whatever I did. And a number of years later, I started paying attention to that again. And it struck me that not only do we connect through vulnerability, but from a leadership perspective, we disconnect through certainty because there's no opening in certainty.
I think that that's not that it's in a human perspective. If we and we are right now, we are living in a world of certainty, intellectual certainty instead of intellectual humility.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
but back to the
curiosity.
point about that we connect through vulnerability, I would take that a step further and say we connect through the emotions. So being vulnerable with your empathy, like really, knowing the difference. But most people have three words for emotion: sad, glad, sad, mad. That's it, which means that's their worldview. And yet there's a giant difference between sadness and anguish,
Yes.
between joy and happiness. They're different. And so if we can really access those emotions, because as you know, we are emotional beings who think we are making rational decisions, but we are not. Everything is made based on emotions, but we deny that. So
Yeah.
I think that the vulnerability is accessing those emotions and being able to connect to someone when someone shares something, when they're troubled or even when they're joyful. If you can be joyful with them, if
Mhm.
you can be, sad or, at least understand that they're in anguish because of something horrible that's happened to them. That's the real, like, now we're bonded because that's the human thing.
That's the human, and this is where EQ comes. I mean, emotional intelligence, is a
Yeah.
huge piece of this.
Yeah.
And I know that that's an area that you're particularly proficient in. How do you actually bring a conversation about emotional intelligence to the forefront so that people can begin to develop more proficiency with that? And particularly here, I'm interested in the self awareness, the whole the foundational piece of emotional intelligence, which is awareness.
Right.
Self awareness, awareness of others.
Yes.
In the work that you do, how does that come into the mix?
Well, especially when we were smaller, it's a little bit harder now that we're larger, although we do still focus on it. I'm sure you're familiar with the Enneagram. There's a million different
Yeah.
personality types, but we use the Enneagram. And the reason that I am attracted to the Enneagram is because, for your listeners, it looks at motivation for behavior as opposed to behavior.
Hmm.
Because different types. There's only 9 types on the ostensibly 9. There's actually more, but let's just keep it simple. 9 types. And, I am a certain type and I can look like another type because of my behavior, but why I behave a certain way is vastly different. And what I found when I first learned about the Enneagram 15, 16 years ago, it changed everything for me. My son was young. It changed the way I parented him because I learned what he was. And I thought, oh, I'm driving him crazy.
Yeah.
And, by learning about myself, the thing about the Enneagram, I think is the self-awareness tool is that as you read about your type, you learn about your type. If there isn't a little kernel of you that is going, oh no, then it's not your type because you see it and you're just like, oh, that's so icky. And it's so me. But the great thing about that is that when you see it, back to Brene Brown, it's like, oh, I thought it was just me. No, this is just human. And this is part of my type, the way my psyche was formed at whatever age that happened. But now that I'm aware of it, I can also learn to soften those edges.
Exactly.
And that the import of self-awareness and leadership cannot be underestimated. I mean, it is the foundational element of brilliant leadership, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
yeah. Daniel Goleman, goes so far as to say it's up to 95% of the effectiveness of a leader.
Yep.
Yeah, is
Yep.
is organized around self awareness. Yeah.
Absolutely. But I always have to say the caveat. Without even blinking, we could think of several very successful leaders who have the self-awareness of the fingernail. So
Yes.
let's be clear that you can be financially successful. I guess what I always look at is what gives your life meaning and purpose. I don't know for those people, and I can't begin to address that. But for me, the meaning and purpose is in my own self-awareness and then in leading other people to become more self-aware themselves, the employees all be, and then that allows them to be more aware of their coworkers or their children or their spouses and being like, oh, they're not acting that way to drive me crazy. They're acting that way because their motivation is XYZ. And it helps me step back from it and gives me a little perspective on it instead of being reactionary.
Yeah.
I can actually take a moment, like you said, and respond.
Yeah, and it's that space that Viktor Frankl talks about between stimulus and action.
Yep. There's a
That
pause.
space is where I
Mhm.
get to actually go, okay, how do I do this? How do I
Exactly.
do this? You've
Exactly.
got a new book coming out, and your cultural balance sheet. So I'm interested in exploring this a little bit because culture is a fascinating thing in an organization. Oftentimes, people find themselves in these organizations, and it's like fish in water. They can't see the water.
Yeah.
They're just part of it. And if you were asking them, well, where's the glitch? Where's the danger? They can't see it because they're in it.
Right.
With your new book, The Cultural Balance Sheet, what are you paying attention to with this?
Well, the title came to me when I was having dinner with some other business owner friends, and several of them had successful exits from their business. So they were talking a lot about EDIBA and multiples and all of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I was just kind of musing, and I'm one of those people that I don't know what I think until I say it. And I said, it's almost like I don't look at my business just through the lens of a balance sheet. I look through the lens of a cultural balance sheet. And a
Hmm.
friend of mine who'd been bugging me to write a book looked at me and he's like, well, there's your title. And I was like, well, I guess you're right. So it took forever, but I finally did it. And what I realized was that it's a it's a great metaphor for the business, because there, you have assets, liabilities, and equity. It's pretty simple.
Mhm.
The big difference as I was working on this and as I was exploring it and kind of studying it and trying to create the framework for it, what I realized is that in some ways similar to a financial balance sheet, but on a cultural balance sheet, you have your assets, obviously starting with people, there's a lot of other things, but the liabilities that you have in your business, if you give them both intention and attention, you can actually move them into the asset category.
Yeah.
So like if, for example, if you are rigid and you're one of those leaders or you have an organization where it's like, well, this is how we've always done it, we're not going to change. You become aware of that, back to your self-awareness point, and you say, okay, I'm going to work on this and try and be more flexible. Well, while maintaining your consistency, which is a fine line between consistency and rigidity, holding on to your consistency, but moving into a little more flexibility, you move that into the asset side. And that's like this beautiful thing. I was like, well, that's a really interesting difference. And then, of course, with this, unlike with a balance sheet, your equity is the actual culture itself that you build through your focus on your assets and your liabilities and working to improve the balance between those two things.
I love that. It's really an elegant way of positioning that, and it's also a doable way to address it. Yeah, a liability does not have to be a deal breaker. Uh,
No, of course
it
not.
actually can become the way to actually enhance the equity of my business if I
And
work.
the self-awareness of being able to look at your liabilities. I think a lot of people don't want to look at that. But
Yeah,
unless you look at these things, you can't actually have any intention around, improving them.
perfect. Where can people find out more about the book and what you're up to?
I am on LinkedIn. I'm just Christy Pretzinger on LinkedIn. I'm woefully bad at social media. I will be improving that in the coming year as I, work to promote the book and, my mission of improving the way people look at the world of work, changing the way they look at the world of work. And we will eventually have yourculturalbalancesheet.com, but it's not live yet. I am also, you can find me and reach out to me at wgcontent.com. I'm very easy to reach. Yeah.
Great.
So
We will
happy
put
to talk
those.
at any time with anybody.
Great. And there's a link there for people to actually get in touch with you, to book you to speak, bring you
Yes.
in and have conversations with. How do I do this?
Yes. I'm
Yeah.
happy to share. We have the book is made, I think it's about 43 culture keys, and we put them in their small, probably about 2 to 3 pages each, because we all have the attention span of a gnat. And I really want them to be actionable, and they don't have to be read in any order. It's like, okay, what about this? What about this? And different actual actions that leaders can take to improve the environment in which they work.
Great. I look forward to getting a copy of it. I
I will
certainly
send you
do.
one.
Okay. I'll take you up on that. Okay. Folks have been listening to Christy Pretzinger, and I want to thank you, Christy. This has been a very illuminating conversation. I've loved this. I could go on for a long time with this conversation with you. I really could. I love how your brain works.
Well, thank you. I could definitely continue the conversation as well. I appreciate you having me on, Blaine. Thank you.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Folks, you've been listening to another episode of The Soul of Business with Blaine Bartlett. As always, find a way in your life to be a center of distribution, not a center of accumulation. You'll find your life works a whole lot better when you're distributing, not accumulating. You take care, and we'll see you on the next episode.